Good morning, everyone. Thank you all for coming this beautiful day. I hope the rain continues to hold off. I am Chris Goodwin with the Mississippi Department of Archives and History. Welcome to the Craig H. Nielsen Auditorium and today's History at Lunch program. If you have not already, please silence your cell phones. We'll be recording this. I note with sadness the passing of Annette Redden, who died last month at age 93. Even though we had not seen her for a while, Annette and her husband Walter were fixtures for years and years at these programs. She never failed to brighten the room, always had a kind word for everyone. So I know many of you may have gotten that news already, but I did want to announce it. On Tuesday, February 27th at the Old Capitol Museum, Paula J. Giddings, author of the biography Ida, A Sword Among Lions, will present Ida B. Wells and the Campaign Against Lynching. A reception and signing will begin at 5 p.m., the lecture at 6 p.m. That's co-sponsored by our friends at the Mississippi Humanities Council. I hope that you'll all be able to join us for that. The annual meeting of the Mississippi Historical Society will be in this building, March 1st through 3rd. Topics to be covered include the blues, the civil rights movement, World War I, and women's suffrage. And there are mailers for the Paula Giddings lecture that you can take as a reminder for that, as well as sign-ups for the annual meeting of the Historical Society all over there by the Cookie and Waters. Please join us here next week when Heather Wilcox will present Mount Olive, Preserving and Restoring a Historic Cemetery. And of course, anytime that you are not able to join us in person, we do live stream all these on the Facebook page, so you can catch us that way. Today, we are delighted to have our friend Max Grivno with us to discuss the fascinating life of Sylvester Magee and tease out fact from fiction. A monument at his grave reads, Sylvester Magee was America's last slave and the nation's last Confederate veteran and the last Union veteran. Born in 1841 and died in 1971 at the age of 130 years. At the time of his death, he was the oldest person in America. Maybe some fact, maybe some fiction. Max Grivno is Associate Professor of History at the University of Southern Mississippi. He was named the 2016 Humanities Scholar of the Year by the Mississippi Humanities Council. His book, Gleanings of Freedom, Free Labor and Slavery Along the Mason-Dixon Line, 1790 to 1860, was published in 2011 by the University of Illinois Press, and Grivno is currently writing From Bondage to Freedom, Slavery in Mississippi, 1690 to 1865, under contract with the University Press of Mississippi as part of the Heritage of Mississippi series. Help me welcome Max Grivno.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you all for coming out. So, 2 disclaimers. First, I love public speaking, but I never use a microphone. So today I'm using a microphone, and I may end up shouting into that microphone. So if I do tend to shout, just ask me to quiet my voice down. Second, because we're live streaming, I need to sit put. This is unnatural for me as well. Not only do I tend to shout, I tend to want to move around a lot when I lecture. So I may be squirming around the podium trying to keep my feet in one place. So, my story today begins sometime in August of 1964. In August of 1964, freelance photographer Herbert Randall received an unusual request from 2 civil rights workers in Hattiesburg. Randall had spent that long, hot summer of 1964 in Hattiesburg photographing Freedom Summer. He snapped over 1,700 photographs that captured faces. The bloodied faces of those who attempted to register black voters, the impoverished faces of black children in neighborhoods like Palmer's Crossing and Bowie Street, the determined faces of local activists, and the young, hopeful faces of students, black and white, who were working at freedom schools around Hattiesburg. But now, Randall had received a request to accompany 2 civil rights workers to a house on the outskirts of Hattiesburg's sprawling Hercules chemical plant. It was an unusual request because Randall had never been told where to go and what to do. He had simply roamed around Hattiesburg and the surrounding area photographing the freedom struggle. The men who asked him to accompany them to this house on the gravel line road did not explain why he was being brought along. When the three men arrived at the house, they were greeted by an old man in a crushed hat. The actual meeting on the man's porch lasted anywhere from 30 to 45 minutes, during which Randall took 3 photographs. Although the pictures seemed to capture a neighborhood canvas, Randall told me that the men were not, in fact, attempting to register this man to vote. They were simply asking whether he had money for food and rent, and whether there was anything they might do to help him. Randall only caught snippets of the conversation. Most of the old man's mumbled responses were either inaudible or incomprehensible. But as the 3 young men made their way back to the car, the old man rose from his chair, ambled to the top of the steps, and declared in a clear, ringing voice, "White folks is still hell on us." As they drove away, Randall was not quite sure why he had been summoned to the meeting, although he sensed that the extreme age of the subject may have been what caught the interest of local civil rights workers. He was right. A few days later, Randall was shocked when the Hattiesburg American read a photograph of the old man, now sporting a suit and tie and flanked by volumes of law books, beneath the headline, "Man Who Says He's 123 Tells of Days as a Slave." The details of the story in the Hattiesburg American were remarkable. The man Randall photographed was, he came to find out, Sylvester Magee, who claimed to have been born on May 29, 1841, on a plantation owned by J.J. Shanks near Carpet, North Carolina. As the newspaper reported the story, Magee and his family had been carried from the Tar Heel State in 1861 and auctioned off at a slave market in Enterprise, Mississippi, to a man named Hugh Magee. Magee was subsequently sold to a man named Victor Steen, who lived outside of Florence in Rankin County. During the war, Magee walked to Vicksburg, where, quote, he was valet to several officers during the siege and suffered 2 gunshot wounds in their service. Magee's defense of the South continued a century later. When prodded by the Hattiesburg American, Magee was quick to denounce the ongoing efforts to integrate Mississippi. Indeed, it was not surprising that the local paper referred to him as, quote, a true blue Southerner, as Magee denounced the freedom struggle as, quote, the biggest mess I ever saw. They're all wrong, he declared, and I won't have nothing to do with it. Magee went on to attribute his extreme longevity to, quote, the Lord and lots of good white folks, the same ones he had denounced just a few days earlier. All my life I have been around good white folks, he said, and they have always looked after me. When I need something, they get it, and they don't ask any questions. Less than a year later, Alfred Penn Andrews, a retired insurance executive and president-elect of the Jackson Civil War Roundtable, took that drive down Gravel Line Road, the same drive that they had taken a year earlier. Andrews had been called to Hattiesburg by 2 local attorneys who wanted him to verify that Magee would turn 124 years old that year, and that he was both the last surviving slave and the sole remaining veteran of the American Civil War. Andrews recorded his perceptions of Mr. Magee as he drove up to the house. He was, quote, the perfect picture of Uncle Tom or Uncle Remus, take your pick. Despite being, quote, obviously a very old man with a fuzzy and long beard, white as cotton, Andrews declared that Mr. Magee's eyes were bright, quote, with a definite twinkle in them, and that his voice was clear and unwavering. Andrews interviewed Magee for several hours that afternoon. He took his story to the press, And within a few days, Sylvester Magee became something of a national sensation. His story drew the attention of President Johnson and later Nixon. The story was seen as so compelling that when Mr. Magee suffered a stroke a few years later, President Johnson intervened on his behalf to have him admitted into a veterans home in Collins, again because he was a Union veteran. A number of media outlets picked up the story, some reputable, some less than reputable. Mr. Magee was taken to New York and Philadelphia to appear on nationally syndicated television shows. The Mississippi Legislature declared his birthday Sylvester Magee Day, and his story still resonates in parts of Mississippi. If you go to Marion County today, its tourism brochure still boasts that Marion County is home to preventative dentistry, bet you didn't know that, and to Sylvester Magee. But was any of it true? If Mr. Magee's claims were accurate, he would have been not only the oldest living American in the 1960s and 1970s, he may well have been the oldest human to ever live. Andrews and those who interviewed him in the 1960s staked their reputations on the veracity of the story. But their research, as I'll discuss, was shoddy. Andrews simply tried to, quote, trip up Mr. Magee. He asked questions that were meant to deceive him, or questions that he thought only a person who had lived through the Civil War could answer, but when you actually listen to the questions, they're not that difficult. He asked, what was North Carolina like? Are there hills in North Carolina? Mr. Magee said, well, yes, there are hills in North Carolina. Andrews thought, wonderful. He asked if the creeks in central Mississippi were windy or straight. Mr. Magee said they're windy, and Andrews concluded, must have been there. At one point, he even asked what color was cornbread. Mr. Magee said yellow. Andrews thought, well, only somebody who had lived through the Civil War could know that. Right? The methodology is deeply problematic. When I first encountered this story a few years ago, I dismissed it really as nothing more than a curiosity. Stories about very old enslaved people were not that unusual. This is Sylvia Hoover, who was from the Mississippi Delta, who for a time in the 1930s and 1940s claimed to be the oldest living American. And here you can see her just a few years before her death. Aged former slaves often drew the media's attention when their lives could be juxtaposed alongside of new technology. So here is a formerly enslaved man, Benjamin Trimble, age 101, who drew media attention when he became the first former slave, near as anybody could tell, to fly on a jet airline. In some cases, these former slaves drew the nation's attention, or at least the media's attention, because they were something of local characters. So here you see Fanny Turner, aged 113, Will Adams, aged 114. Charlie Smith became famous in the 1970s with claims that rivaled those of Mr. Magee. Mr. Smith claimed to be the last survivor of the Middle Passage, and his claims were taken seriously at the time. So much so that during one of the Mercury missions, he was brought into the VIP booth to witness the launch of the rocket. But what about Mr. Magee? The question The question of Mr. Magee's age is one that I'll get to over the course of the lecture, but as I began peeling back the layers of the onion, as I began looking more and more closely at this story, I was drawn in many cases more to the historians who were investigating his claims. The story of Mr. Magee, it seems to me, is, at least in part, the story of the people who were trying to investigate his story, who were trying to determine whether or not he was 120 or 130 years old. And when we look at the people who were investigating his story, we have to begin by looking at the context. When Mr. Magee's story broke, Mississippi was still reeling from a decade of intense and often violent struggles over black rights. The beatings, imprisonment, and murder of African American activists, most notably the savage beating of Emmett Till, the riots at the University of Mississippi, and the murders of Shermer, Cheney, and Goodman in Neshoba County were all fresh in people's memories when Sylvester Magee's story broke. Now, the man who recorded Magee's history and who bore much of the responsibility for making it a national story was not a mere bystander to the events of the previous years. A.P. Andrews was a staunch segregationist who used history as a sword and shield against the freedom struggle. In the biographical material that he sent to his speaking engagements, Andrews boasted that he was, quote, an unrepentant, unpardoned, and unreconstructed Southern rebel who refuses to appease his enemies and the enemies of his state or to compromise his convictions upon the political altar of any man to the detriment of his people. Andrews viewed black Mississippians really as nothing more than parasites. Within a month of his interview with Mr. Magee, Andrews delivered an address before a white supremacist group in Brookhaven, Mississippi, in which he declares, quote, the African belongs to a race of consumers and not producers. He can only get along if he consumes what the white man produces. He cannot function without our help. The Negro as a race has no moral standards. The civil rights movement had come as an immense shock to Andrews. And as a historian, Andrews turned to the events of Reconstruction to try to understand what was happening to Mississippi in the 1960s. Andrews time and time again drew connections between the freedom struggle of the 1960s and the first freedom struggle of the 1860s and 1870s. Time and time again, Andrews referred to Frederick Douglass as, quote, the Martin Luther King Jr. of his day. And he did not mean that as a compliment. He described abolitionists gathering to sing the civil rights standard, "We Shall Overcome." He ordered copies of the film Birth of a Nation to be shown around Jackson. And time again, he declared, quote, Negro voting is an infamy to Mississippi. And this was the man who was going to reconstruct the story of Sylvester Magee. It's a story that unfolded against the backdrop of the civil rights movement. It's the story of a man who, at least some claim to be a former slave, that was being told by a dyed-in-the-wool segregationist, a man who was determined to keep black people in something very much akin to slavery. Andrews' views of Southern history and race relations cast a long shadow over his interviews with Magee. Consider, for example, how Andrews treated Magee's claim that he had escaped with Union soldiers and fought alongside them at Vicksburg. For a staunch defender of the lost cause, this was a dilemma that would have to be explained away. In Andrews' mind, enslaved people had been loyal. They had been docile. They would have been inclined to fight for the Confederacy, and now he was encountering a man who claimed to have run away to fight for the Union. Andrews' solution? He tried to convince Mr. Magee that he had been duped. Andrews declared, quote, these northern soldiers pushed you colored soldiers in front of them. You boys were the ones who got shot first. You boys didn't know the reason that they were picking you up. You didn't know that. They told you they came down here to free you. And during this part of the interview, Mr. Andrews' voice grew louder, more rapid. It's almost a kind of staccato of declarations. And Mr. Magee had very few opportunities to even mutter a yes, sir, or a no, sir. In the story that Andrews was telling, Southern soldiers were the patient defenders of Black Americans. When you charged, they let you get out of the way so they could shoot the Yankees, Andrews declared. White Southern boys would wait until you black men came through the lines because they didn't want to kill you. Magee murmured in response to this. Andrews finally paused, caught his breath, and waited to make certain that the former bondsman had absorbed his version of history before sighing, Sylvester, I just wanted you to see that. I wanted you to understand that. I wanted you to know that I was right about that. It's clear that what's happening in these interviews is that A.P. Andrews has picked up the story of Sylvester Magee and that he's trying to use it to essentially defend Jim Crow. That in many ways, Sylvester Magee is a kind of prop or a tablet onto which he's projecting his interpretation of history. And these interviews, they went on for hours. And as I listened to the interviews, it occurred to me that what was happening here was a rewriting of history. And I began to wonder, what is the truth behind this? We have the interviews from A.P. Andrews, but then we also have Mr. Magee. What can we actually determine about Mr. Magee? I actually didn't think it would be all that hard to reconstruct his story. After all, historians today have a whole range of genealogical tools at their disposal that A.P. Andrews could never really have dreamed of. We have census records up until the 1940s. We have optical character recognition software that lets us comb through federal and state records that have been digitized. Again, I really didn't think it would be all that hard. So I began by trying to think about the kinds of records where Mr. Magee would have surfaced, and I thought maybe World War I draft cards. The draft swept up black and white Mississippians. Presumably they would have taken anybody near military age. So I thought if Sylvester Magee was living in Mississippi in 1917, his draft card must exist. And if it does exist, it should give me quite a few biographical details about him. The problem, as I came to discover, is there are quite a few Sylvester Magees. On June 5th, 1917, Sylvester Magee did complete his draft registration card in Precinct 3 of Jefferson Davis County, Mississippi. Magee claimed that he was born in Covington County on July 14, 1893, that he was married with 3 children, and that he worked on the farm of T.W. Conaway near Bassfield. The very next day, July 6, 1917, a man named Sylvester Magee registered for the draft in Covington County, Mississippi. The details of this man's life were similar, but not quite identical to those of the man who had registered a day earlier. This man was born on April 8, 1894. He worked on the farm of F.M. Mathis in rural Fire District 1, just outside of Collins. A year later, yet another Sylvester Magee registered for the draft in Jefferson Davis County. This man did not know his birthday. The man at the draft office thought he looked to be about 45. He didn't list an employer, and he claimed that his nearest relative was Frances Magee, although he didn't say who exactly she was. So there's 3 Sylvester Magees. A day later, along comes Sylvester Magee number 4. But this Sylvester Magee was 33 years old. He was the sheriff of Jefferson Davis County. He had salt and pepper, gray and black hair, white skin, and blue eyes. And I concluded that he was not, in fact, that Sylvester Magee. But there were still 3 other possibilities for Sylvester Magee. And as it turns out, there are close to 7, 8, maybe 9 Sylvester Magees who were of African descent, who lived in South Mississippi or South Louisiana, who could very well have been Sylvester Magee. Bless you. Part of the problem that I ran into was that the people who interviewed Mr. Magee in the 1960s or 1970s wanted very particular details about his life, what he did during the Civil War, for example. But they never thought to ask, what were the names of your wives? What were the names of your children? A genealogist often needs 2 points, especially when you have a fairly common name, which I sadly discovered Sylvester Magee was. I didn't just need Sylvester Magee, I needed the names of a wife or of a child in order to match him up against other records. For years, I struggled to find an answer, and it proved very difficult. I reached out to people who may have been descended from Mr. Magee, most of whom viewed me with suspicion. I was the 3rd or 4th or 5th white person who had come along trying to reconstruct their family history. The descendants of the family who had enslaved the Magees, in some cases, were very helpful, but in other cases viewed me with measures of suspicion. I was, after all, an outsider with a decidedly un-Mississippi accent and a very strange last name. So cracking that nut proved really difficult until, now you all laughed about this earlier, I looked at one source a little more closely. The National Enquirer. When the National Enquirer interviewed Mr. Magee, they asked, how many times have you been married, and what were the names of your wives? How many children did you have in those marriages, and what were their names? It's a basic question. It's a humane question. It's a question that meets Mr. Magee on his own terms. Tell us who you are. Once I had those names, I could begin reconstructing his biography. It seems very likely that Mr. Magee was born sometime in the 1890s. There are census records that match up with the names given in the Enquirer's story that show him being in his 20s in the 1920s and then progressing forward from there. It seems he was not, in fact, 120 to 130 years old. His last marriage record, this one is in the Forest County Courthouse in Hattiesburg, shows him in 1949 giving the age of 60. So well short of 120. So if Sylvester Magee was not born in 1841, and if his story was not necessarily the one recorded by A.P. Andrews, what are we to make of it? I'm going to suggest that the stories that Mr. Magee told were not necessarily his stories, but the stories that were told to him by his father and by members of his family. Mr. Magee's father was named Ephraim Magee. And if you go over to the Department of Archives and History, you can actually see the bill of sale in which his father was bought by a member of the Magee family. It's very likely that Ephraim Magee was born sometime in the early 1840s. If that's the case, what Sylvester Magee has done is he's essentially taken on the stories of his father. There are other elements of the story, again, that seem to be stories that were circulating in the community. Consider, for example, the story that Mr. Magee was from Carpet, North Carolina. This is a detail that emerged very early, the 1964 story in the Hattiesburg American. He was from Carpet, North Carolina. In his interviews with Mr. Andrews, he was from Carpet, North Carolina. Now, the problem with that story is that Carpet, North Carolina didn't exist in the 1960s. Moreover, when you go back and look at the records of the U.S. Postal Service, there's no evidence that Carpet, North Carolina had ever existed. So he claims to be from a town that never existed, but he mentioned the name of the man who had owned him or his family in North Carolina as J.J. Shanks. The Shanks family were large landholders and large slaveholders in northern North Carolina. It's entirely possible, again, that Mr. Magee was picking up details of stories that had been corrupted over time. Perhaps Carpet, North Carolina did not exist, but the Shanks family did. And it's entirely possible that his father, Ephraim, may have been sold from North Carolina to Mississippi at some point in the 1830s. If we take a look at the 1870 federal census of Covington County, Mississippi, it's easy to find Ephraim Magee there, living close to the descendants of the family that had enslaved him. And if we look at the black Mississippians who lived in Covington County, who lived in the neighborhood of the Magee family, there's a large concentration of people with the Magee surname who list the place of birth as North Carolina. So it's not difficult for us to imagine young Sylvester Magee hearing stories perhaps from his father or perhaps from people in his neighborhood who described being moved from North Carolina to Mississippi. Similar stories were circulating among the white Magee family and within the larger community. In 1946, for example, a local historian published a piece in the Simpson County News describing how Robert and Margaret Magee, who had owned Ephraim Magee, had traveled to North Carolina in the 1820s on horseback to purchase enslaved people to bring with them to Mississippi. The journey lasted, quote, many months and stretched some 900 miles. In the story, the family and the enslaved people they brought with them had to flee from wolves, they had to flee from Native Americans, they had to flee from robbers. This was a story that was in many ways seared into the white family's memory, into the community's memory. And again, if we think about how stories are transmitted, I think it's very likely that Sylvester Magee was able to pick up this story and in many ways make it his own. And the more I look at his life story, the more I see examples of details that might not fit his life perfectly, but that do fit the lives of other African Americans who would have lived a generation earlier. Now, Mr. Magee's narrative also mentions many acts of violence. He describes being chained. He describes being whipped. He describes being beaten. He actually describes the murder of 2 people by the family that enslaved him. This is a story that is in many ways sort of steeped in violence. Now, the people who interviewed him in the 1960s assumed that what was being described to them were stories from the Old South, that the stories of people being chained and beaten were stories of slavery. But I would submit that it's entirely possible that a man born in the 1880s and 1890s could have had similar memories. In the 1880s and 1890s, peonage cases in South Mississippi were widespread. Black Mississippians were held in something very much like slavery, in some cases because they owed money to white landowners. In some cases, they were simply seized because they could be seized. If you go through the records of the Department of Justice describing peonage cases in this part of Mississippi, you see many stories of people held against their will, chained, beaten, and in some cases murdered. The vast majority of peonage cases were never investigated. They were never prosecuted. So it's entirely possible that what's being described by Mr. Magee in the stories is not a story of slavery, but a story of peonage. That he was simply being held as a child because his family owed money or because somebody could and did seize him. But when the people who investigated the story in the 1960s were looking at it, what did they want to find? They wanted to find stories of slavery. So when he told them that he had been beaten, they heard a story that had to do with slavery. So Mr. Magee may not, in fact, have been 120 or 130 years old. His story may have been bent and twisted in the hands of segregationists who simply wanted to use his story for their own advantage. But one of the things that strikes me are those moments when Mr. Magee's voice, almost like a flame, rose up. Those moments where he stood at the top of the staircase and announced to the civil rights workers that white folks have always been hell on us. And in those interviews with A.P. Andrews, there are many moments when Mr. Magee found his own voice, when he went off script, and when he gave you a sense of who he was and what he believed. Mr. Magee was, by all accounts, a deeply, deeply religious man. Time and time again, he credited Providence for his longevity. "The Master brought me this far," he once said. "I know I'm going to go home when I leave here. I'm not going to hell. No, sir." Magee once boasted that he might live another 40 years. But as time passed and his health failed, he grew more circumspect, more resigned. At one point, he confided to a relative, "I don't know how much longer I have to live, but I know in a vision I had a few days ago, I saw the promised land, a land where I felt blessed to know the joy of love, the respect of my fellow man, and the grace of our Father." As time went on, Magee speculated more and more about what death might bring. He thought about reunions. He thought about reunions with some of those wives he had lost. At one point, he told an interviewer that his wife was waiting for him on the other shore. "That's where she's going," Magee remembered. "I took her word for it when she told me. I told her I will be there too. God's going to let us be together one day." So it's a deeply religious man who's looking for a time when he can come back to his family, but he's also a man who had a profound sense of justice. For Magee, the journey home would not only bring reunions, but also retribution. "I get to thinking sometimes," Magee told one interviewer, "laying in this bed, I'll be gone. I've had a hard road to travel in my life. I had a mean, mean master." Magee described how one man had beaten him, starved him, and worked him without mercy, only to turn around and say, "Sylvester, I want you to forgive me." Now, Magee assured the young man interviewing him that he had, in fact, forgiven this man. "I gave it to the Lord. I said, 'Lord, forgive him. He knows not what he's done.'" But Sylvester Magee was not Jesus hanging on a cross at Golgotha, and he was not Uncle Tom praying for the soul of the man whipping him to death. There was a hard edge to Magee's religion. There was a hard edge to how he saw the world. Near the end of one of the last interviews done with him in 1969, Magee fumed about the pittance that he had received for years of hard work. "They say we won't work," he said. "They say that we're lazy." But Magee then went on to recall how one man had paid him $5 for 4 years of work. "Lord, if anybody's worked hard in this world, I have," Magee said. "Ask anyone, and they'll say I'm the hardest worker, but I ain't got nothing," he spat. And then he looked and turned to his interviewer, and echoing what he had told those interviewers back in Hattiesburg in 1964, there's going to be a reckoning. God's going to pay them at the end. No matter how hard people have tried to contain the story of Sylvester Magee, no matter how hard they've tried to make him a prop in some story to justify Jim Crow or a romanticized version of the Old South, Mr. Magee's story continues to burn through. Whether he was 68, 78, or 128, the story of Mr. Magee and of the historians who investigated his story is in many ways a story of Mississippi. A story of conversations about the heritage we all share but refuse to discuss. A story about justice that is at times very painful. And a story about wounds that are oftentimes raw and open. Thank you. So now I need to have my standard disclaimer. I've done this lecture now several times to several audiences, and there are always people who come forward. The first time I did this lecture, a man who knew Mr. Magee, who in fact had been one of his neighbors, came forward with a batch of photographs that had been taken of Mr. Magee in the 1960s. At one point, somebody came forward who claimed to have known the Magee family as far back as the 1940s. So I'm always happy to have people who have elements of this story come forward, because as I mentioned earlier, I come at this as an outsider in almost every way. For the white family or the white Magees, the people who had enslaved Sylvester Magee's family, there's suspicion. For the black descendants, there's suspicion too. I get that, but I truly am often relying on the kindness of strangers as I reconstruct this story. So, if anybody knows something about Sylvester Magee, I'm happy to hear it. So, yes, yes.
Has anybody ever set Mr. Andrews straight?
Mr. Andrews is long dead.
Okay.
No, there was a lecture that I gave one time where somebody raised a hand and said, well, actually, I'm descended from A.P. Andrews. But they were actually just trying to scare me. One of the interesting parts of the story is that almost all of the people who worked on Mr. Magee's story in the 1960s died before he did. Mr. Magee buried A.P. Andrews. He buried Arlington Jones, the attorney in Hattiesburg who had done some work on him. He outlived many of them. But again, one of the things that strikes me so much about this story is it's an attempt, I think, in many ways on the part of Andrews to capture this story, to take this man who at least some people thought was very old, a man who some people thought was a Union veteran, and he's trying to take this story and sanitize it, warp it. I'm not quite certain what the verb is, but he's trying to bend it to fit his own political views. And the result is, again, I think he missed things, right? Many of the stories that Mr. Magee told, I think they're true stories, right? The stories of the beatings, the stories of being chained. But you don't necessarily need to have slavery to have that story. That story works just as well as a peonage case from the turn of the 20th century. But if you go into the story looking for slavery, you're probably going to find it. Yes?
Do you know how many children he had? It says on there that he became a father at the age of 109.
Yes.
Have you met any of his relatives?
No, this is one of the problems that I ran into. Mr. Magee, in his interview with A.P. Andrews, he said that he had 6 children, all of whom died at very young ages. And if you look at the dates he offered, they would have all died before their 10th birthdays. Now, there's the last child, Margaret Magee, born in 1949. It's less than clear what happened to her. She moved to New York State with her mother at some point in the 1950s. But if you think Sylvester Magee is a hard person to track down, try a Margaret Magee living in New York. It's been very difficult. I've tried different avenues on social media to track people down. I know he has relatives in the area of Columbus and some people who were relations who moved west. But again, in some ways, one of the maddening parts about this is in the 1970s, when the trail was not quite as cold, the story was essentially left to drop. many of the papers that I'm working on, the papers that A.P. Andrews had, they were given to one of my former colleagues, Bill Scarborough, in the 1970s, and they sat on his bookshelf for over 40 years. So when I tried to pick up the loose threads, people who may have known him in many cases were dead. Yes, sir.
So I have two questions.
Yes.
Based on your data, what is a more accurate age for him, number one?
Right.
And number two, was there much consistency in his stories?
Okay, so two really important questions. How old do I think he is? If I had to guess at the time of his death, probably in his 80s or 90s. But again, I would underscore that is simply a best guess based on data points where I can see him and his family in one census, then they drop off the map again. The details of his father's story are actually a lot easier to track than his story. As far as consistencies or inconsistencies in his story, one of the problems that I have with his story is he's never given the opportunity to simply tell his story. I have recordings or interviews that were done by 4 or 5 different historians and journalists over the years. These are on reel-to-reel audio tapes. Nobody ever sat down and said, "Mr. Magee, tell me your story." In many cases, they come in with a story already in place, and they just begin rattling off a series of questions. And it's those kind of unguarded moments that I think are the most revealing. The moments where he's asked a yes or no closed question, and he offers a very long response. The moments where I think he goes off the script are the most interesting and the most compelling ones. Yes, ma'am.
Who's the amount for embellishing his age? What could possibly be the motive?
Oh, okay. So for him to exaggerate his age, I can give you 2 sets of motives. The motives that he may have had and the motives that people who investigated his story had. The motives that he may have had to go along with the story have to do with the dire poverty in which he lived in the 1960s. He was well beyond his working years by the time he became famous. This did not generate him all that much money. But again, the wolves were at the door. If you take a look at the photograph here, you can barely see a sign just by the crown of his hat. And you see that same sign in all the photographs taken that day. The house that he was living in was on the market. Basically, while he was living there, the landlord was looking for somebody else to put in the house. The conditions inside the house, let's see if I have an image of it here. This was a shotgun house without indoor plumbing, without electricity, right next to the Hercules chemical plant outside of Hattiesburg. So it was really desperate poverty in which he lived. The motives for the people who picked up his story, people like Andrews, I think they were political. I also think there was an element here of, you can almost imagine a journalist trying to get a scoop. Whoever could get the story was desperate to try to run with it. And I think it led some people to essentially ignore problems. In that first piece in the Hattiesburg American, he's referred to as a personal servant of Confederate officers at Vicksburg. There's no mention made of service in the Union Army. The very next year, he's a veteran of the Union Army. The last interview that's given, the interview in 1969, he claimed to be at Gettysburg. Now, to be at Vicksburg and Gettysburg and be uncertain about the side, I think many of the people who were investigating the story knew the inconsistencies, but they chose not to focus on it because they were chasing after the story. Yes? No, Ephraim Magee was not a veteran of the Union Army. But again, Ephraim Magee, you can still find his grave in Jefferson Davis County. The receipt for his sale to the Magee family has survived. He shows up in tax records and census records consistently as soon as the Civil War ended, and he seems to have done quite well. The grave that he has in Jefferson Davis County, it's knocked over now. But you could tell when it was built, it was quite impressive. He has his photograph has been put on the marker. He had not a very large personal estate, but it was valued in the several hundreds of dollars, which was quite an accomplishment for a man who was born and who came of age in slavery. He is much easier to track, and some of the people who would have been Mr. Magee's siblings are easier to track as well. He had one sibling who became a physician, another who became a school teacher. Their stories, again, they can be tracked. It's Sylvester Magee's story that is the more difficult one to reconstruct. There are times where he's not in the household. There's one census where Ephraim Magee and the entire family is there, but Sylvester Magee isn't. Right? There's almost a kind of at times where he just sort of seems to disappear in the records. Other questions? Oh, yes.
So where are you at with the book?
This one, what I am desperately looking for, to be honest, is I am desperately looking to interview people who are descended from Mr. Magee to round out the story. Part of the reason is I find myself feeling very uncomfortably like the other people who have tried to make hay off of this story. And I don't want to be in a position where I come in and try to poach his story without doing as much as I can. Obviously, his voice I'm not going to get anymore. But the voice of his family, I think, would be an important one to add to this. And it's also one that nobody ever really attempted to get. When Andrews interviewed him, Mr. Magee would sometimes have a relative in tow, and Andrews would dismiss them as, he called them hangers-on, gold diggers, that sort of thing, that these relatives of his were simply in his way. Members of the Magee family, the white Magee family, have been incredibly generous over the past year, sharing what they know. In some cases, family papers, that sort of thing. But the other side of that family story, it's been missing, and that's part of the challenge. And again, it's one of the reasons why I do some of these lectures. The very first one I did, a man who lived right across the street from him on Gravel Line and who helped take care of him when he was getting quite old and unwell, came forward just out of the blue and began telling me all these amazing stories about him. So there's another part of the story that I'm trying to finish.
Have you run into other cases like Mr. Andrews have done similar things? I guess
taking stories, yeah. This case, the case of Charlie Smith, I think is in some ways similar to that, where Mr. Smith's story is The evidence suggesting that Mr. Smith was not 130 years old is really quite compelling. He left a fairly long paper trail suggesting that he was probably in his 70s or 80s. And the people who helped promote his story, they weren't necessarily looking to support Jim Crow. They weren't necessarily trying to romanticize the past. I think in some cases that story there's more hucksterism, maybe. People looking to make money off of him. But again, this is one of the challenges of telling the story of slavery. The most famous set of slave interviews, the WPA interviews, they're essentially black stories being filtered through white interviewers. There's always that kind of level of distortion going on, where there's one voice there, but it's a voice that is filtered through that of a white historian who very often was a product of his or her time and is attempting to kind of push back against that story. Other questions? Yes.
If I could.
Oh, yes.
I'm sorry. I arrived a little late. It's a purely technical question.
Yes.
When did you begin, you must have covered this, when did you begin on this work with your background?
Yes.
And let me add in that, on the slavery-connected questions,
Right.
are there people of the Ira Berlin crowd who worked on matters like this, and maybe even some data on this particular case that you're working on?
So it's funny you should mention that. I studied with Ira Berlin in graduate school, so I'm in the Ira Berlin crowd. Yes, right. So the question is this an area that historians are beginning to focus on? If I understand your question correctly.
My question is more specific.
Right.
Are there other people who have done similarly serious work on this particular case?
Not on this particular case that I know of. I think so.
All right, other than Andrew.
Right, other than Andrews. Right. So I began working on this case probably about 3 years ago is when I first became aware of Mr. Magee's story. If you go to almost any county historical society or library, they'll have a clippings file. And it could be civil rights, it could be automobiles, it could be any number of topics. And almost every county I went to, they would have a slavery file, and they would also have a see also Sylvester Magee. So I kept coming across traces of this story. So I called my university's library and said, "Do you have anything on Sylvester Magee?" And they said, "Yeah, we just picked up 2 boxes of material when Dr. Scarborough retired." He had inherited Andrews's research notes. A couple of weeks ago, I had the good fortune to get the research notes of a fellow named Michael Mulehorn, who had done research on Mr. Magee in the late 60s and early 70s as well. So I've been slowly kind of compiling this information, but to pick up on an earlier question, it has the same problem. It's essentially people like myself, outsiders in one way or another, trying to approach this story and to make sense of it. The motives vary. I like to think mine are better motives than some other people, but I'm still very much aware of the fact that this isn't my story. And it's a story that I think we need to find ways to get Mr. Magee's voice and those of his family, I think, to the fore more effectively.
Max, that was great. Thank you all for coming. Help me thank Max Grivno for this program today. We'll be around if you have further questions. I hope we'll see you all at the Old Capitol Tuesday evening of next week when Paula Giddings will be talking about Ida B. Wells and the anti-lynching campaign, and back here next week for Heather Wilcox's program. Thank you.